this is a follow-up question to could Jesus have sinned? And I made the argument last week that Hebrews says he was tempted in all ways as we are, except without sin. That there had to have been at least a real pressure to sin, a real potential of sin, because that's the statement. How could he be our great high priest if all these temptations are there and there's not any pressure for him to commit them? Then it says that he's a sympathetic high priest because he was tempted like us, only tempted without sin. And so I made the case that I think that implies there's a real temptation for Jesus, that the temptation in the wilderness was a real temptation. And so in that regard, I would make the case that yes, in his physical life, that there was real temptation for him. Obviously, God is sovereign and omniscient. He clearly would not have sent his son if he thought his son knew his son would give in to human sin. Clearly, he knew he would withstand it. But the person's question here is James 1:13 says God, cannot be tempted by sin, or I think really the point there is that God doesn't intentionally cause people to sin. I don't think there's a point about God never allows temptation, because all of us face temptation. And so the whole point there is in James 1:13 is someone saying, oh, God made me do it. And then the statement from James is God doesn't ever tempt anyone with sin. God's not a tempter of people like that. And the primary point there is not about the humanity of Jesus and the pressure his humanity was under. He had the capacity to sin or not. If he's equal with God, he cannot be tempted, except we are told explicitly he was tempted. That's what it says in Matthew chapter 3. He was tempted by the devil. That's what it says. And also we are told in Hebrews that he was tempted in all ways as us, yet without sin. I think the James 1:13 primary is that Jesus didn't force temptation on other people. And so I think that's more the idea. That's a good question. This is not an easy answer and an easy question. This comes up a lot in discussion. Since he didn't sin, it becomes apparent that his deity had influence over his humanity in some respects. Well, that may be, but let me ask this question. Could Adam and Eve have stayed in the garden without sinning? If the answer is yes, it's because they volitionally chose not to and used their desire to honor God over their desire to be tempted by the devil. If Jesus was born without a sin nature, i.e. the virgin birth and his divine nature and human nature, I would argue that he could theoretically, the way Adam and Eve could have theoretically gone without sin. Only he, unlike theoretical in Adam and Eve's case, does go without sin. And so does the deity aspect of Jesus influence the humanity of Jesus? The answer to that is yes, of course. But I'm hesitant about distinguishing those. There's a great deal of historical heresies like Nestorianism of the over-separation between the humanity of Jesus and the deity of Jesus, where Nestorius distinguished them so much so as to say when Jesus got hungry, that was his humanity. When he walked on water, that was his deity. And those kinds of things got refuted as heretical, and in the process they said, no, Jesus is fully God and fully man, but we're not going to sit around and say he was half God, half man, or anything like that. We're going to say he's fully God, he's truly God, he's also truly a man, and as a man, the one difference between him and other people is that he, like Adam, has not a sin nature. And so I would argue that in his humanity, obviously, I think you're right, influenced by his deity, he decides to honor his Father in every thought and action. So I would argue the temptations were real, that he was being tempted by the devil. Matthew 3 was a real temptation. That Hebrews says he was tempted in all ways as us, yet without sin, was real temptation, like a real press on his soul, but he said no to the temptation so that he could sympathize with us when we struggle with sin. And the James 1 text is primarily not about whether Jesus faced temptation, but about whether God would lead believers into sin or whether believers get into sin on our own lust of our own flesh. And I think that's primarily the argument of James 1, not about the deity, humanity of Jesus Christ. So I'm a little bit hesitant about James 1:13 as a proof text for something in the argument about the humanity of Jesus, when Matthew 3 and Hebrews, which really is talking about the humanity of Jesus, says directly that he was tempted. And so that would be my argument there. But I understand the tension here. I've heard these arguments on both sides, and they're really well done. And your argument that you've written here, obviously you've really thought through it, and for that, that's terrific, and I commend you for that. I just lean towards these were real temptations, and that he was really tempted. I hope that answers the question. If not, we can keep the dialogue going. I appreciate it. All right. Have a good week. We'll see you at 7:17.
Set a fire down in my soul.